Are people still willing to give up the American dream to go serve the underprivileged? Perhaps it's overseas or in a difficult, at-risk location. That's the question we're going to be addressing today.
I flew to Guatemala on my first ever missions trip with my church, and we spent a week in an orphanage. That exact moment, I realized, wait a minute, they love God. Like, they have a deep love for God, and He clearly loves them.
I know there are people out there still doing this, giving up the American dream to serve the underprivileged or overlooked.
And I knew that God was calling us as a family to move to Guatemala as full-time missionaries. Before this trip, there was zero chance of becoming a missionary, but I knew that's what He was calling us to do. We put our house on the market. We sold our 2 businesses. 7 months later, we had sold everything we owned, and we were landing in Guatemala City. Are you living your life in a way that if you're in a court case, that someone would say, yeah, that guy's following Jesus?
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome back to Missions Pulse, where we encourage you to know God's heart and join His mission. The question that we're going to be addressing today, the topic of this whole conversation is this: are people still willing to give up the American dream to go serve the underprivileged? Perhaps it's overseas or in a difficult, at-risk location. That's the question we're going to be addressing today. And if this is something that stirs your heart, I pray it does. Go ahead and subscribe to this podcast, share it with a friend. I think you're going to be encouraged on this particular episode because my guest actually today wrote a book with that very question embedded in the subtitle of his book. The book is called Do You Love Me? And as soon as I hear that, I immediately kind of think of Jesus talking with His disciples and then going on to say, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And the subtitle of his book is called Giving Up the American Dream to Serve the Underprivileged. George Sisneros, hey, great to have you on the show, man. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm been looking forward to it all week, so I can't wait to dig in.
Awesome. Well, I just feel encouraged that we somehow got connected online, and here we are. I think we're going to have a lot in common, and I really look forward to hearing your story. You sent me your book. I've read most of it, not all of it. Still working through it right now. And super excited to hear someone who's written another missionary book. They're so rare in our world today.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't even know how it has come together kind of quickly. I don't know all the details, but I actually feel like that book was inspired by God without really me knowing about it, because what He's doing with it right now is changing everything for me. So it's been great.
Yeah. Well, by the way, you're also the founder of Ordinary Missionaries. First thing I gotta say, I love this. I love this organization name. I often talk about the word missionaries and preface it with an adjective like historical or even legendary if I'm talking about Amy Carmichael or Hudson Taylor or someone like that. Tell me the idea behind Ordinary Missionaries. Where did this name even come from?
Yeah, it's crazy. I think at the end of the day, I recognize how incredibly ordinary I am. I mean, I'm really kind of the last person that you would imagine would be a missionary. So I think that God uses ordinary people, and He's not looking for qualified. I know this is so cliche, but He's really not looking for qualified as much as He's looking for obedient. So that's where it came from.
I, I love how you're talking about that. I wrote a lot about that in The Mind of a Missionary. How God uses ordinary, run-of-the-mill folk. And I think people often have this tendency to think, well, if you're going to be a missionary, you're kind of that special elite forces type person who goes over there to do missions. And even like before before we started recording, we were talking about people misunderstand what we even do. And tell me a little bit about your journey. What do you do? And what is your passion? How did you come to this place in life? That you were an ordinary guy, and now you're still an ordinary guy with a missionary at the end of that.
Yeah, it's crazy. Back in, I think it was 2010, I was just down in my basement watching a football game. My team, the Denver Broncos, had lost a game. I don't know why I remember, but I just, I turned the TV off and I was just sitting there, and I felt God asking me a question. It wasn't an audible voice or anything. I just felt in my heart and in my mind that God was asking me a question. He asked me, "Do you love me?"
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, like immediately, I'm like, of course I love you. I mean, I got back from church this morning or whatever that meant to me at the time. And then he asked me, do you love me more than you love your wife? And it wasn't such a quick reaction. And I thought to myself, listen, I spend every day with my wife. I see her every day and we have coffee together. She knows every little thing about me and I know every little thing about her. And so I thought about it. And what are you going to do? Lie to God? So I told him, yeah, I love my wife more than I love you. And then I felt him ask me, do you love me more than you love your kids? And as a parent, so we have four biological kids, and we have time for biological kids. I would die for my kids. If my kids needed my heart, I would give them my heart.
Hmm.
And so I said, I love you. I love my kids more than I love you. And that's a hard thing to say. Like it didn't just roll off. Like it was a realization that I had not thought about.
Hmm.
But then he asked me, I just felt this like question in there that was, do you love me more than you love the Denver Broncos? Which is kind of, um, it's kind of funny because I'm like, well, of course. And then I thought about it, and I just spent 3 hours watching the Denver Broncos
Yeah.
lose a game, like I do every single Sunday. But I never spent 3 hours in a row praying to God. I'd never spent in my whole life, I was 45 at the time ish, never spent uh, 3 hours praying, singing. I'd never spent 3 hours in a row reading my Bible.
Hmm.
Yet, so I here every Sunday, no problem. 3 hours watching a Bronco game. Sometimes if it's two good games in a row on a Sunday, I'm down. So it really got me questioning whether or not I even loved God or whether I even knew who He was. And so I made a commitment that I'm going to stop praying, and I stopped praying for my businesses. We owned a couple of small businesses. I stopped praying for my family, health, safety, things like that. And every time that I felt that I wanted to pray, I just wanted to dig deeper into knowing God. And so I traded it all for a forward prayer. I love you, God.
Hmm.
And so for an entire year, I prayed, I love you, God. And that's it. That's all I prayed. That was my prayer life for a whole year. I'm
Wow.
I'm not advocating for that. There's no magic in that, but for me, that's where I was. A year later, in 2011, I remember well, November 2011, it was the day after Thanksgiving. I flew to Guatemala on my first ever missions trip with my church, and we spent a week in an orphanage. It was at that time, it was December 1st, 2011.
Hmm.
I remember being at the back of this feeding center. It was actually a big cafeteria connected to the church. And I remember seeing all these kids, 200 kids,
Wow.
poor kids. And the worship band started up and they started praising God. These are like poor kids praising God, thanking God. And it was at that exact moment I realized, wait a minute, they love God. Like they have a deep love for God and He clearly loves them. And it was at that point that I realized, you know what? I love you. I love you, God. I'd been praying it for a year, but I felt it that day. And I really feel like that was the day that I finally met Christ.
Wow, that was powerful. Well, when you talk about that, it immediately makes me think of where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, and how valuable our time is. Our time, our talents, our treasure, where we invest into that tells a lot about who we are and what we love and whom we love. And it sounds like a powerful testimony. It seems to me that led into the book that you wrote. We'll get into that in a minute. By the way, it is 50 stories of over 10 years as a full-time missionary in Guatemala. I've been reading it, and I've been looking at the chapter titles, and I wanted to ask you this. You've seen some incredible ups and downs, some highlights after saying, Jesus, I do love you, and then making the hurdle, the jump to go move overseas as a missionary. Some of the chapters in your book are very telling. One is the food wouldn't last, and we all knew it. Extortion in El Rosario, 100 water filters. I'll never get used to a tiny white casket, and I miss home. I immediately hear the nuance in these chapter titles. I hear the ups, I hear the downs. So how does this affected your call and response? Jesus, I do love you, when you experience those ups and downs?
Wow. Listen, I mean, as you know, I have to imagine that as a missionary, like our lives are ups and downs. Like I can literally be at the top and just feel like, wow, we're making a difference and we're being obedient and feel incredible. And then by noon, like that's at the beginning of the day, by noon, you're
Yeah.
just disappointed and frustrated. And am I learning this lesson? And so, at the end of the day, we need to keep our focus on him. And again, it just sounds so cliche, but when we realized that we were called here by him, and so we
Yeah.
felt very convicted, like we felt there was no question that we were called. After that missions trip, my wife wasn't with me. She was at home with the four. And after that missions trip, I remember I flew back home. I remember getting back at like 11 o'clock at night. It had just snowed. And so there was snow on the ground. I remember, stepping on it and it kind of crunching under my feet. And like, that's how vivid this memory is. And I, got inside and greeted my wife and we hugged and then we talked to the kids. They were in bed, but I said goodnight. And then my wife and I were just laying in bed. And I knew that God was calling us as a family to move to Guatemala as full-time missionaries. Before this trip, there was zero chance of becoming a missionary, but I knew that's what he was calling us to do. She, as it turns out, also knew just through our what was it before Zoom? I can't remember, but
Skype.
we Skype. Yeah, we were Skyping like
Yeah.
we Skyped 2 or 3 times. And through our Skype conversations, she's like, what's going on here? And so when we're laying in bed and I'm kind of recounting everything that's happened, and then I told her what I felt God was calling us to do, which was to leave everything behind, to sell everything and follow him to Guatemala. We were laying in bed, I was holding her hand and she just said, yes, let's do it. Like, that's it. I know this sounds crazy. It took me a while. I'll be honest with you. It took me a couple of years to recognize that we didn't pray about it. Because it's something
Yeah.
you should pray about, right?
Sure.
But
Well,
when
well,
you
so they
are
say.
sure,
So they say,
when
but
you're sure,
yeah, exactly. I know where you're
yeah,
getting
when
at.
you're sure, when you realize God is calling you, you don't have to pray about it. And it's so weird. Literally 2 years in, I remember reading through the Gospel of Matthew and Jesus calling Peter to follow him. And I recognized, wait a minute, Peter didn't stop and pray about it.
Yeah.
Like he went home and he told his wife, or he went home and he followed him. And so that just gave me a ton of peace because I carried kind of a burden for a couple of years. Like, man, I didn't pray about it. Well, like when it's Jesus asking you to follow him, we didn't pray about it. So I don't even know if that relates to the question you asked, but.
Well, no, I love what you're saying there, because I think we've kind of almost over romanticized this idea of praying about following the commands of Christ that he gave us 2,000 years ago anyway. The Chosen series does a great job of this visualization of the disciples following Jesus. He says, come, they drop their nets and follow him. I also have a similar story. When I first moved to China, I had been on a couple short-term missionary trips with Teen Mania Ministries, Acquire the Fire, and Ron Luce, if you remember those conferences. And so I'm in Russia, then I was in India, then I was in Hong Kong at age 15, smuggling Bibles into China. What were my parents thinking, letting me do this? I don't know. Mom and Dad, if you're watching this, thank you, and I'm still confused. But
Yeah.
I just loved Asia. I felt the missions bug got me, and I fell in love with serving the underprivileged and serving the overlooked. And so I had this conversation when I went back home, and it was almost something like this: God, I really want to go to China. Is that cool with you? And he says, sure, yeah, sounds good. And I didn't feel like this audible voice from heaven, and it was very similar. I didn't pray through anything. The commands of Christ say go. Go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and not or to the ends of the earth. And it's a natural tendency in the Christian mindset. It should be that we follow those commands because, and it reminds me of Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord. He'll give you the desires of your heart. When you delight in yourself in the Lord, his desires rub off onto yours. And so it's inevitable and natural that you would want to follow his footsteps. I think that's what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, she said yes, and this is the craziness of it. This was on like December, I don't remember, December 3rd maybe. And she said yes. We didn't want to put our house on the market over Christmas and New Year's. So like January 5th, we put our
Hmm.
house on the market. We sold our two businesses. 7 months later, we had sold everything we owned and we were landing in Guatemala City. So it was literally drop your nets as fast as we could. It was drop our nets. And 7 months later, we were in Guatemala.
So that's not the recommended way of going
No.
necessarily, say all the missions agencies, and there is a missionary attrition. But the question is here, as I see someone like you, an entrepreneur who gives it all up, becomes a missionary, I know there are people out there still doing this, giving up the American dream to serve the underprivileged or overlooked. Is that a small percentage of the church? Where what is the call that you would make to those who are living the American dream, maybe going through the motions? What is the call to them?
Really, it's interesting that this book has really turned into like it was already after I read it. So I wrote this book over 10 years. That book is actually just those were just newsletter stories that we sent back
Hmm.
to our supporters and compiled.
Yeah.
Some of them were never sent out. Some of them were just in my journal, but they were compiled of 50 stories. Once it was compiled, once it was done, that's what that book has turned into is really a challenge to Christians in various forms. So, number one is, do you know Jesus and are you following him? Are you living your life in a way that someone, if you're in a court case, that someone would say, yeah, that guy's following Jesus? And so it just challenges you to draw closer to him. First and foremost is to draw closer to him.
Hmm.
Secondly is to align your life with him and what he wants you to do. So it's wow. I mean, it's been a while since I've been in the American church, right? Like really in church, 10 plus years. So I don't know where the state of it is now. I do know this. We have a lot of people who are faithful in supporting this ministry. And I think that if you can't go to the field, you should be supporting someone in
Yeah.
the field. I
Yeah.
firmly believe that. It's the same thing, in James, pure religion is taking care of orphans and widows.
Yeah.
If you can't do that, you should be supporting someone who is and who can,
Hmm.
so that you can participate. I know that you are a big advocate for the 1040 window and the unreached, as you should be. If I were to go back and do it again, I would probably go to the 1040 window.
Hmm.
I didn't know any better. I didn't know anything when we got onto the field. We just wanted to go, follow Jesus. That's where he called us. And as it turns out that we found our place.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I could kind of hear almost the struggle in your voice, like when you're saying this, because on one hand, you want to say, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few, come join us, and then the call that Jesus gave us to go into all the world, preaching the gospel, teaching them, making disciples, baptizing them in his name. But we have seen such a decline in missionary service over the years. You look back in the late 1800s, during the missionary generation, of what sociologists call them, the missionary generation, where actual missionaries did go overseas. In fact, they packed their bags in coffins and went overseas. And my question is, are we still that dedicated, not only to the Sunday morning experience, but to the global cause of Christ, this redeeming rescue plan that he has on his heart? And we become so myopic, we think it's all about America, or name your country from where you're from. But God desires that none should perish. And that includes people from Guatemala and Thailand and China and all over the nations. So I only say that because I hear the struggle in your voice. You want goers, you want senders. But you also know that different people have their places. But I think there is a deeper call that Jesus is calling us toward.
Man,
I just, sorry, I opened up a can there.
no, I have here are my deep, true feelings. Is I think that the American church is filled with a lot of people who believe that Christianity is an hour or 45 minutes on a Sunday, and to try to do the best that they can throughout the week. And I think their hearts are far from Jesus. I just feel that way. Like churches, we're talking Christian churches that are filled with people who don't know Jesus. How is that even possible? So if you look at some statistics, for example, 18% of people, one study says, Christians read their Bible every day. 18% of Christians read their Bible every day, like some ridiculous number of people who have ever read through the Bible ever. That's crazy. But then you looked at, so we teach the Bible here. We're teaching these boys. We run a small private Christian middle school, and we're teaching these boys to be men of God. But being men of God is more than reading the Bible. It's about learning how and knowing how to study the Bible. So that's like the next layer. But there's like 2% of Christians who read and study the Bible. Well, what does studying the Bible means? It's not just reading it for, to check it off of a list of getting through the Bible in a year. It is trying to, it's understanding, well, who is Matthew? How old was he? What faith, where was he in the world? Just every detail. Where is Bethlehem and on the map? And do we understand, or do most people even know that Bethlehem is in a completely different country? And that there's just so many details in as we're reading the Bible that we don't even think about. So I think that learning to study the Bible is important. I don't think many Christians are doing it. But so why do we do it? Why read the Bible? Why? It's not to check off something for a reading plan. We read the Bible to know him, to fall deeper in love with him. And so that's, man, if I could go back to the States I would go back to the States to be a missionary and to teach people to read and study the Bible, to know Jesus, and to fall deeply in love with him. Because when you fall deeply in love with him, to love him is to love him with all your heart, mind, and soul, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Loving your neighbor as yourself is, there's just so many voices. It's not just helping them. To really love your neighbor is to introduce them to Jesus and to help them grow a relationship with him. So, I don't know, man. I'll be honest with you. I get frustrated with the American church because I think that there are a lot of churches, a lot of mega churches that are really just wolves in sheep clothing, and it's a bit scary, to be honest with you, man.
Yeah, well, you're obviously talking about something that is, I think, so prevalent. And there's multiple different dimensions to why this has happened and the cultural milieu that we find ourselves in, and then we add to that Christian nationalism. But what we're seeing is an anemic gospel rather than a robust gospel. What we're seeing is people who make decisions but don't make disciples. And the lack of discipleship in the American church has led to such an anemic kind of perpetuance of the Christian faith, certainly in the eyes of the world. I mean, the word evangelical has so many pejorative and negative meanings and connotations now. I still hold to that title. I want it to mean its original definition. Going back, though, to the whole title of your book, Do You Love Me? I think that's the theme that is going to drive people to answer that question. Are people still willing to give up the American dream to serve the underprivileged? Absolutely not, if the answer is no to that first question, do you love me? And if we love him, the tagline, the byline of this podcast, know God's heart and join his mission. When we sense his heart, it's not drudgery, it's joy to join him on mission.
Yeah, man, I think that this book that I wrote is challenging. It challenges people to really identify that main question, which is, do I love him? Do I actually love him?
Yeah.
Listen, here's a really quick litmus test, and maybe I'm wrong here. This is just my idea. If you want to see where Jesus is in your life. So if you were to put these in a priority, listen, I promise you, ask 100 people from your podcast or 100 people in church. Where's your priority? God, job, family, or yourself, right? And so this is what everybody's going to say. Well, God first, of course, and then family, of course, and then my job, and then myself. But okay, well, that's fine. Now let's take a look at your schedule, and let's take a look at your checkbook or your finances, your bank account. Okay, so now organize those in the way that, in order. And what people are going to see is a completely different order. Generally, God is going to be at the bottom. Literally, people spend more on their pets for Halloween costumes, or they spend more on vacations. And I'm not saying you shouldn't go on a vacation. I'm just saying, be honest with yourself, because that's what it took for me. I realized and recognized that I wasn't even sure I loved God. If I loved the Denver Broncos more than I loved God, that's a problem. So I think that it's just be self-aware, be honest with yourself, because at that point, now you can be intentional on making a change if you want to. Because the rich young ruler went to Jesus and said, well, what do I need to do? He said, well, sell everything, give it to the poor and follow me. And he's like, yeah, but what else can I do? Like, is there another scripture? Is there anything else that I can do? What if I tithe regularly to my church? Is that enough? What if I support, 10 missionaries out on the field? Is that enough? So to sell everything and follow him is a big, big calling. I'm not going to say that means going to another country. I'm not going to say that even means selling everything. I mean, to me, it did. It hit my heart hard. And we own 2 small businesses. We're living in our dream home. But when you fall in love with Jesus and then he calls you, it just wasn't even a question. Sure. And so it's going to be different for everyone. Listen, man, don't get comfortable in church.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. Do not be comfortable in church, because 45 minutes a day or 45 minutes a week with Jesus and a prayer before meals, maybe a prayer with your kids before you go to bed, that's all good. But I'm telling you, that does not equal. That is breadcrumbs. Man, I hate saying that out loud. It is that's just a fact, bro.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that you're saying that out loud, but it is okay, because I feel that it's still tinged with grace, and you have the example of your life. You were that guy, I think. I don't know your story completely, but 2 businesses, your dream home. You're describing to me what many consider to be the American dream. They're trying to keep up with the Joneses, but then suddenly something changes and shifts in your heart. And you're right. Not everyone is called to Guatemala. Not everyone's going to go to China or Thailand or other places. And that's fine. But the point here is, Well, I guess what you're saying, you're echoing the words of Jesus so much, George, that it's kind of hard to carry your cross and die to yourself. Is that really what you're trying to get people to do, either through your book or through this message or through your lifestyle?
Here's the first thing that I would love to happen is for people to just drop everything in their mind, any preconceived ideas of who they are, and to be self-aware of, do you love Jesus or not? Because listen, if you don't, you're going to hell. Like at the end of the day, if you don't know and love him, that again, nobody's going to preach this. You're not going to hear this on Sunday. That's what the Bible says. And so my prayer for people reading this book is to recognize, just to be self-aware. Do you love him? Like, man, if you don't love him, you've got to fix that. And I am assure you, it is not going to church. Now that may be a start if you're not going to church, but it is bigger than that. Like, read the word of God. He placed those stepping stones in there for us to follow him, to get to know him. Listen, I'm not a big believer that the Bible is kind of a guidepost. I'm not saying it's not. It's not a guidepost for me how to live a better life and how to be successful and how to have peace. That to me, that's not why I read the Bible. I read the Bible to get to know him better, to fall in love with him. For me, that's it. Now, along the way, listen, God is amazing. And so along the way, we learn, we can read through Proverbs and learn how to be better human beings and how we can love our neighbor and all these things that will, help us from tripping over ourselves. But for me, that's why we're teaching these young boys to study the Bible, because we want them to fall in love with him. Listen, if you fall in love with him, your life will change. 100%. I 100% believe that. Everybody is going to say, I love Jesus. Every Christian walking out of church is going to say, I love Jesus. And it's, read through the book of James, study just that book, study the book of James, because what he says is that, it's not, our works don't qualify us, but they do show us, they show ourselves, like, do I love him? Our works. So we're not doing these things. I am not here. That I probably one of the things I hate the most about being a missionary is that when we go to a function here in Guatemala, it's like they set a place for us that's like with the pastor and the mayor, and it's like they put us in front, and I just absolutely hate that. Like, to the point, I call it, we go to a wedding, if we're invited to a wedding, we want to go to the wedding, we are literally at the same table with the bride and the groom. We are ordinary people who love Jesus, and that's it. And so, and when you go back, this, when you go back to the States, it's like, hey, can we take you out to dinner? Hey, here's our cabin for the weekend, or whatever it is. And I just, man, and listen, I love that they want to love us in that way. But it is, I don't know how you feel, man, but it just makes me feel bad, because I would rather they just, I want them to fall in love with him. I think at the end of the day, that's it, man. Like, at the end of the day, I want them to fall in love with him in a way that they are like 100% sure. And I don't even know where I'm going with this, but it's just.
Well, I have that same thing. It happens more in communal cultures than it does in more individualistic style cultures. Like in America, they're not going to go and seat you up in the very front next to the president and the pastor and all the big dogs. But it happens all the time for me here in Thailand. It happened all the time in China. You're the missionary, you're the man of God. So, but then you come back to pure and undefiled religion in the eyes of God. What is it? It's widows, it's orphans. Then the litmus test at the very end of the ages, when Jesus separates the sheep from the goats. Hey, do you remember when you visited me in prison? You remember when you gave me a drink when I was thirsty and you fed me and then I was naked? And no, we never did that, Jesus. We never saw you like that. No, what you did to the least of these. It's always the least of these, the undeserving, the underprivileged, the overlooked, the orphan, the widow. And somehow, in God's upside down kingdom, he spins everything on end and shows us the value of real things. And so I think that's what you're getting at. We don't have to be in the limelight. We don't have to be at center stage, because in the end, stopping for the one, serving the poor is such a powerful expression of the incarnational aspect of Jesus leaving the most exclusive gated community in all of the universe to move down among us, mere humanity. So I completely hear what you're saying. A minute ago, you asked me, or you mentioned, if you were to do this all over again, you do something different. So I want to ask you again, if you were to do this all over again, or start back way before the call or the trip, initially to Guatemala, would you have done something different? Would you have stayed behind? Tell me about that?
Yeah, I think I would have done something different. I want to ask you the same question. I'm very interested in
Okay.
this, in the answer of this question. But for me, I would do it differently, knowing what I know now. So knowing what I know now, I would study theology. I would study the Bible more than I did, because I've done most of my study has happened over the last 10, 12 years. So that's number one. And so, for example, I've got two sons. One is 18, one's 21. My 18-year-old is going to Bethany Global, and he is
Oh,
studying
cool.
to be a missionary.
So that's cool
But a
that you
full-time,
mentioned that. I'm sorry to cut you off. That's cool that you mentioned
no,
that, because we just had a strong partnership set up with Reach Global. The now president, David Hawes, was my intern
yeah.
director at Teen Mania. And so some of our staff here are from BGU. So cool connection. Anyway,
What?
sorry to cut you off.
That is
Yeah.
really cool. So he's going to BGU. My 21-year-old son went to BGU for a year and decided that missions really wasn't his calling, and so he is working on an internship with the local church. And then next year in the fall, he's going to be going. I can't remember the name of the school. It's John Piper founded it, maybe
Oh,
in
yeah.
Minnesota. Anyway, he's going to be going
Multnomah.
to school there. Yeah, honestly, I'm not even sure, but he's going to be going to school there, and he's going to he's going to get his master's in divinity. He's studying to plant churches and to be a pastor. And so, I mean, when they talk to us about the things that they're learning, I am just so jealous in a good way. Like, I'm just so proud of them,
Yeah.
but also just jealous. Like, I'm like, if I could go back, I would have started earlier. I would have done that, for sure, studied, and then also going to another country. I probably wouldn't have chosen Guatemala. That's where God called me, and that's where we came. And we didn't know any better. We didn't even know what the 1040 window was. And so, the 1040 window is really a region of the world that people have never even heard the name of Jesus. So that, I think that's where my heart is. That's where, if I were to do it again, that's where I would go. We're within, I would say, a year or two of kind of this ministry being fully sustainable by locals. We have the last piece that we're working on right now. And so we don't know where God is going to call us. We also have adopted 5 little ones. And so that kind of, we're not as maybe flexible to go anywhere and everywhere, but we're down. And so
Awesome.
we're within a couple of years. Who knows? But our heart is there. And so, what we can do is we can support missionaries financially that are overseas and that are
Yeah.
in the 1040 window, because I'm a big believer, huge believer in that.
So you've adopted 5 little ones, and as soon as you said that a while ago, you cut out about how many children you adopted and how many biological you have. Total, how many children do you have?
9.
9. Okay, yeah. It cut out for some reason as soon as you adopted X amount of. I didn't hear. That's cool. We adopted a little girl here from Thailand, and now I only have 2. But I kind of feel like I do know where your next calling is with the next few years. It's Chiang Mai, Thailand, to join us here.
Nice, nice.
Not the voice of God disclaimer. I'm sorry. I just had to say that. um,
Yeah, that's amazing. So tell me if you, I mean, would you do anything different? You started out early.
yeah,
So
I would have
what would you do?
started.
Because
I would have started much earlier, like when I was 6. Bought a one-way ticket to China. um, it, yes, I would have. It's such a strange thing. You wish you could do the Back to the Future thing. You know so much more with a. When I was 18, I barely had a frontal cortex grown. So,
yeah,
I just
yeah,
bought a one way plane ticket to China. I didn't speak any Chinese and started studying for 4 years in China. Thankfully, God led me to this apostolic group of men who mentored me along the way. And being an independent missionary, my goodness, I've seen 1,000 come with passion and crash and burn quick. Within 2 or 3 years, they're gone. And
yeah.
thankfully, I was saved by that from this group of men from Ireland, America, Denmark, Holland, and Malaysia. That was our group. And our motto was,
Wow.
"We have done so much with so little for so long, we can now do anything with nothing." That's kind of changed my life. Um, but yeah, I think I would have also probably gone through an organization. But then again, I'm so happy that God led me on this journey. And as an independent missionary, I had the opportunity to not be within a structure that was um, didn't give me the reins to start something new. I've always been a starter. So for me, that gave me the freedom to say, okay, I uh, I can start our own ministry with Inreach Global. But I should have had more safety nets in place, relationally, financially, and so on. But looking back, yeah, some days I wake up and think this is awesome. I'm here in Thailand. I have this story in China. Other days, yeah, by noon, maybe like you said, I'm thinking, what in the world have I done? I remember my initial calling to China. It was 1997. I was living in Hong Kong for about 6 months and smuggling Bibles every day, 3 times a day for many hours from Hong Kong into China. And I remember going across the border from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, pouring rain, and we had all these code words for Bibles. You didn't ever call them Bibles. You never called the tracks tracks. You called the tracks crumbs, and the Bibles you called bread. Well, I remember this little story of when I was like 3 years old, and my mom told me later, when you were 3, you said, "I want to bring bread to the people of China." I said that when I was 3, 1981. There I am smuggling all this bread into China. And um, it struck me like the Holy Spirit spoke and said, "This is what you're called to. You're bringing bread to the people of China." I remember going back to Hong Kong and just dedicating my life to China and to the unreached. I said, "God, I'm willing to go anywhere and do anything and eat anything." Big mistake. And and so, but then along the way, you hit obstacles and you question like, why? I could have been really successful in business. I never lived my adult life in America. But so
Mm,
there's things that I think I regret and things that are kind of maybe haunt me sometimes. Like I should have
mm.
done this, or maybe I would have been better there. But here I am, and I'm so thankful for my wife, my kids, the ministry the Lord allowed us to pioneer, and the lives that are being transformed. So would I have done different things? Absolutely. But here we are, right?
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things where it's like you would never go back and do it again because you're so blessed right now with family and with with whatever it is that's in your life. But if I if I knew I could have that still have those things, I think so. I guess this is really the answer to the question for me would be if I were advising someone what to come onto the field, how would I advise them? And what are some things that would be a good thing to do? And number one is man, be in love with Jesus. Like
Mm.
I so cliche. I almost don't even like to say it because it's like, but that is really it. Once you get that, everything else takes care of itself. So, be in love with Jesus and continue to fall deeply in love with Jesus. Continue to read and study and fall deep in love with him. Because as you know, maybe it's just me, but you go through seasons where it's like I've gone through on the field here in Guatemala seasons of, are you there, Lord?
Yeah.
Like, and questioning even my faith at times, which is crazy. But
I've
you get
never
through
once
that.
had that happen. I have had a perfect run for the last 23 years. No, I'm just joking.
You're my hero.
Yeah, right.
So I think that I think one thing I would advise people to do if you're thinking about coming onto the field, first of all, I encourage you. Um, I think for sure you should pray about it. God calls us, but what does that look like for you
Yeah.
specifically? I would encourage you, if you're married, to make sure some things are in order. I would make sure that your marriage is in order. You will not, I promise you, fix your marriage on the field. So make sure your marriage is strong. I am telling you, David can probably attest that uh, you're going to lift each other up. Like literally, you're going to carry each other at times. And so your marriage should be in order. And also, do not come onto the field with debt or come onto the field if your finances are not in order. And why do I say all this? Because I have seen many Christians come on, the ones that last 1 or 2 or maybe 3 years, that they come onto the field hoping that this is the thing that's going to change, whether it's their finances or whether generally their relationship, and it just doesn't. It tests your relationship. Thanks to God, I have an incredible marriage. We came onto the field with, um, an amazing marriage, but it has gotten stronger. It's strengthened our relationship.
Mm.
But if we didn't have that, it would be a problem. So, those are things I wouldn't go onto the field, looking to find someone in another country to get married. Like that's not a good reason to follow Jesus into, whether it's Guatemala or Indonesia or wherever it is. Don't do it that way.
Yeah.
So, those are just a couple of things that I think, listen, the most important thing is just be self-aware. Like just, man, I don't even know how to do it other than, be sure you love him, man.
Yeah.
Like, man, my heart breaks for, on Sundays, people going in and I don't know who loves him or knows him or not. I don't know, but I do know this. It's a narrow road.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people in churches today, filled with churches, that believe that they know him, they believe that they love him, but they don't.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you're describing some people. You're calling out the missionary candidate, right? The potential missionary candidate. Let me ask you this,
Mhm.
because I read in your
Yes.
book and I've seen a bunch of your posts about you describing your past, right? And you describe it in detail, and I think you're very public about it because you see in the transformation. What about those people with a past? Um, are those still the people whom God can use, that can make an impact in the world, that could transform a life, that can extend the kingdom of God? Tell me maybe a little bit about your past, if you're willing, and speak into those who have a past and perhaps
Yeah.
think, well, this thing isn't for me, or God can't use me in some certain way.
Well, first of all, I a crazy past. I mean, you know, grew up just rebellious and drinking in high school, like a lot of people, and smoking, which led to smoking marijuana. I smoked marijuana every day for my entire junior year. Throughout high school, I was basically a small thief, if you will. I mean, I stole from anyone and everyone. It's embarrassing to even say, but the reality is I stole all the time. I stole from the church offering as an altar boy when I was
Wow.
younger. I stole from relatives. One night, my cousin and I were at a party that, 45 miles away. and it was like 2 a.m. How are we going to get home? There's no one. We were going to, that our ride bailed on us. So we just started checking unlocked doors and to cars, and we found a car that was unlocked with the keys up on, what do you call those? The visor. And we drove home. So we stole a car and we parked it in front of the police station, hoping that, nice guys, hoping that the police would figure it out and get them their car back sooner. Well, no, it sat there for 2 weeks. Every day I drive by or walk by and I'm like, the car is still there. So, I was a pretty bad character, I think. I went to college and got my girlfriend pregnant. The crazy thing about that is I was planning on breaking up with her. I remember it was the end of the semester and we were going on summer break, and I thought, wow, what a great time to break up with her, because we would have this physical distance over break. But then, I could kind of let her down gently, if you will. Well, during finals week, she said that she told me she was pregnant. And so, we finished the semester. We never went back, neither one of us. We got married, made the best of it. And as it turns out, the best of it lasted 5 whole years. And, we raised our daughter together for 5 years and then separated, divorced. So we divorced. So here's a divorce guy, smoked pot, just crazy, blackout drunk, things like that. But it took a lot of years of healing like this. I wouldn't recommend you leaving that and then the next year going out onto the mission field. That all happened, I don't know, 25, 35 years ago. So that, I have a past, but absolutely anyone with a past can love and serve Jesus. Loving Jesus is the greatest commandment, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. So make sure, there's a reason that Jesus says that's the greatest commandment.
Yeah.
That's the greatest commandment, is to love the Lord your God. Listen to this, with all your heart, mind, and soul, right? It's not like love the Lord your God on Sundays from 9:45 to 10:45.
Yeah.
And before dinner. So yes, absolutely. I just was part of a movie here in our little community. We live in a really small village in the mountains of Guatemala. And this gentleman who I had seen and knew about, he was a pastor. He stopped me one day. My wife and I were leaving to go on a date. And he stopped me and he said, hey, we know that you guys adopted. We're in the process of adopting and, wondering if we could talk to you guys. And we're like, let me just tell you, that is crazy town. Generally, so in Guatemala, adoptions are closed. What that means is you have to be Guatemalan or a permanent resident to adopt. We're permanent residents and we were able to adopt.
Okay.
People in the villages of Guatemala, I've never heard of it. So when this guy told me he was thinking about adopting, I'm like, immediately, I'm like, yes. Can you meet tomorrow at this time? We set up a meeting. We go, we find out that they're going through this process to adopt this little boy and this little girl. And he started telling me about his story. As it turns out, we helped them kind of get their house to a standard that they would be able to adopt. That's how we were going to help him. That's what he was looking for. And we didn't even question it. It was no, of course. And so, but through this process of getting to know him, find out this guy, this pastor, was part of one of the worst gangs in Central America. It's MS, which stands for Mala Salvatrucha or algo, something like that. But it is actually, what he told me is that's just kind of what people know them as. The reality is it's satanic membro satánico is what the name of this gang is. So like this guy killed people, like rival gang members, like regularly. Yeah. And he is a pastor. So I'm like, so he's telling me the story and I start writing about it and I start sharing it, asked with permission to people in the United States who were supporting us. And at some point it just got too crazy and I stopped sharing it. And I said, listen, someday we're going to make a movie about this, but today's not the day. And so that was a couple of years ago. We just finished the micro documentary. It's 20 minutes long. If for some reason someone wants to see that, send me a DM on Twitter or send me an email or get a hold of me somehow, and I will send you a copy of that. We haven't shown it to anyone yet, but this video, David, is crazy town, and it gives me chills. And so this literally is the answer to your question. Can someone with a past love and serve Jesus? 100%. This video is earth shattering. It's crazy.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be the first person to send you a DM on Twitter. I want to see it. I love that answer. And I also appreciate you sharing about your past, because I think this demystifies the, majestic platform of the missionary who serves overseas. It's like one of those little graphics, the four corners, what my family thinks I do, what my church thinks I do, what someone else thinks I do, what I actually do. And we know who we are. We're ordinary folk, run-of-the-mill missionaries who simply said yes to Jesus. And anyone who says yes to Jesus and follows after him on a daily basis is going to be surprised how God uses them. And man, that's just a powerful story. Your life, this pastor friend's life, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing that. Let me ask you this. After you've shared all this, you've shared your passion, you've shared your heart. I think you've shared it over and over that loving Jesus is the central aspect of what this book, Do You Love Me, is all about. But what do you hope readers take away as they read Do You Love Me?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I want them to read that and question. I want them to be so self-aware of whether or not they love him. Like, to me, that's the number one overarching theme and question. Do you love him? And then I think it is just a challenge. Okay, if for the people who read that book and they do love him and they do want to follow him, I pray that it challenges them to get to the next step, to move forward in that direction a little bit. I don't know what it's going to, listen, that's going to be a million different things and a million different steps for everyone. It's going to be different for everyone. So, for someone, it might be adopting to, the Bible lays it out fairly clearly, that we should take care of orphans and widows. That taking care of widows in America isn't the same as taking care of widows here. We, after being here for 9 years, we realized, well, how many widows are there in our little village? So we literally we asked pastors, we asked the mayor, we asked leaders in the community to identify every single widow that was in our community. And so we're kind of in the middle of COVID. How are they eating? Things like that. We identified there were 41 widows in our little community, 41 widows. And so we just made a priority to visit each one of them. How are you doing? How are you eating? How can we help you? How can we love you? And this is 8 years into this ministry that we kind of had this, light bulb go off. So as it turns out, as crazy as it seems, out of the 41, there were 5 who were alone. There were 5 who were struggling daily. And so we just take care of them, and we stop by with firewood and with food every single month. And right now we're working with one of the ladies who has diabetes, and it's pretty severe. So all of her doctor appointments, all of her medication, we are just taking care of them. And so what does that look like for you? Listen, I'm on the field, and I am always praying to God. God, open my eyes. This is one of my biggest prayers, like couple prayers. Number one is, God, open my eyes to be able to see people the way that you see them. The second kind of big prayer that I have is, so in Guatemala, we have a security wall just because it's a dangerous country to live in this very tiny country, which is a third the size of my state of Colorado. There are 100 murders a week. And so it's fairly dangerous. Anyway, we have this security wall. Most people, if you can afford it, you have a security wall. And we have a big metal gate. And so I pray that someone would come to our gate every single day. my prayer is that someone would come and that God would open my eyes to see them in the way that he sees them just for a minute. Let me recognize them. And so, I would read, I would read this book, Dangerous Prayers. I don't know where I have it.
Such a great title.
Yeah, Dangerous Prayers. I can't even remember who wrote it, but it's an amazing book. I would listen. If you want to go to the next level, I would read. There's a couple books I would read. Can I recommend? I'm going to recommend a couple.
Yeah, let's do it, man.
Number one is the book that got me onto the field was Francis Chan, and it was I'm having a mind block.
Letters to the Church?
No, it was.
No, that's his more recent.
Love. It was his first book, his first main book, and I cannot believe
Crazy Love.
Crazy Love. Jeez.
Yeah. Okay.
So number one,
ministry.
Crazy Love.
Yeah.
Number two, Radical by David Platt.
Yeah.
If you can make it through those two, I would just as a Christian, I would read the book God Has a Name by John Mark Comer. And then I would. And then I would also read this book called Dangerous Prayers, but I can't remember who wrote it. I have it here
Craig
somewhere.
Rochelle,
I don't know where it
Francis
is.
Miles.
Yes. Yeah.
Francis Miles?
Okay, so this book, it's Groeschel.
Oh, okay.
I cannot believe I'm not seeing it here. Anyway, doesn't matter. So it is that book really challenged me to one of the dangerous prayers is God, use me. Like, use me. Be careful, because if you're praying with your heart for God to use you, he'll use you. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So those are some top reading books that I would definitely get. And yeah, of course, there's so many great missionary biographies that I would absolutely get. And I think that, I think back to just the story of Esther, and how she became queen, and she was behind the palace gates, right? She was on the other side of the palace gates. And I really feel like, as an American, I feel like we were born to privilege. We were born behind the palace gates. But why was she put there? It wasn't so that she could have, this big, huge castle with all of her needs met. It wasn't so that, she could go on 1 or 2 vacations a year. That's not why God put her behind the palace gates and as queen. He did that so that she could save her people, so that she could go to the king and advocate for them. That's why she was there. That was the entire reason she was put behind the palace gates. So the question is, as Americans, why were we put there? Why were we given all of this opportunity? It was not for the vacations. It was not for the better jobs. I'm not discounting any of that. I had all of that. And I am also not saying you should go become a missionary. If God's not calling you, if you're not feeling that, and that's dangerous to say as well. If you're not feeling it, listen, I believe that God is calling you to love him, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, love your neighbor as yourself. So then, that's the question, how is God asking you to love your neighbor? Right. Yeah. And, I don't even remember what your question was, but here we are.
Well, no, I mean, this is the passion is coming out. And this is what I love to see happen on Missions Pulse, because people get a taste for this and realize it's all very simple. There's no magic to a plane ride. You spend time with Jesus. When he and his spirit rubs off on you and you're so intimately connected with him and he is in you and you in him, as it talks about in Ephesians, it is only natural then that you want to bless others. The Abrahamic covenant is the story of the whole Bible. It's the epic, the great epic of the Bible. I know we can keep talking about this all day, but I really appreciate you sharing your heart. I'm so glad you wrote this book. And I think it's going to be an inspiration for people. The big question, do you love me? Man, George, thank you so much for sharing your heart, for taking the time to, speak into our lives today. And I just pray that God would continue to bless you, your family, and everything you put your hand to. And you would continue to challenge people with that very question, do you love me?
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. If I could leave just one thing with people, I think kind of like on a last note
Yeah.
is what do we as missionaries get out of this, right? At the end of the day, like what are the, I think people are like, what's the blessing? Like, what do you get out of this? Here's what we get. We get a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's it. And that's enough. Like, we know him, we love him, and he loves us. That is enough. It is not about acquiring stuff. I'm 56 years old, man. And as I look over my life, we had a lot of stuff. And I think that especially now as we come to like Black Friday coming up, and we've got Christmas coming up with all of the commercialization of it. I think, at least in our case, when we were living in the States, it was always a time of Christmas was unfulfilling, and we felt like it was never enough. So we felt like we were on this, every year had to be better. And every year we felt more and more unfulfilled, taking our eyes completely off the cross. And so as we go into November, December, I want to encourage people to really just get off the treadmill, or the mouse wheel, the wheel, and slow down, and just keep your eyes on him, because he is enough. That's it. There's no special prize. He is enough. And, our eternal salvation is enough. Being in heaven with him is enough. And it all sounds, very cliche, and these
It's
are
funny
things that
how it
Christians
sounds so
should say.
cliche. It's funny how it sounds so cliche, but it is so, there's no other way to state the truth. This is the reality. Your book royalties are not what you got in this for. Right.
By the way, if you're thinking about writing a book, there are no book royalties that are worth pursuing. It's not about that for sure.
What? No, this is my get rich quick scheme. You just
Yeah,
bursted my
not gonna
entire
happen.
bubble.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, no, I do pray that people pick up your book and are encouraged and inspired. And thank you for those words. And man, many blessings upon you, my friend. Super excited about this next season of ministry and your life, and pray that God's hand would be in you and your family.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we met, man.
Yes. As George is talking, man, the reality is really so simple. I encourage you to pick up his book. It's called Do You Love Me? Simple Question, Giving Up the American Dream to Serve the Underprivileged and Thinking About Our Privilege. I wrote this book behind me. It's over here, Gospel Privilege. Such a pejorative term these days, right? You think of privilege and white privilege and male privilege and socioeconomic privilege. The reality is, though, like he just said, we are born, many of us who are watching this are born into a certain privilege that cannot be understated and overstated. And so the big question is, do you love Jesus? And how then will you walk out the gospel on a daily life? I pray that you would realize that it is very simple. No magic sauce, just like George said. It's the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and do what? Love your neighbor as yourself. Orphans, the widows, those undeserving, those underprivileged. I think as you do this, you might be surprised how God uses you and transforms your life as your life impacts many others.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join his mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.